Good deal. So welcome everyone. For most people, welcome back. But for anyone that's new to the class this semester, I am Mr. Nash. I will be your U.S. history teacher. And so game plan for today is kind of a quick review / orientation, just kind of highlighting, different key pieces of the class, jog people's memories. I'm going to probably go through a lot of this quickly since it's largely going to be a review. But for anyone that is new to the class, some quick introductory information about myself, pictures of the family and the dogs and all that good stuff there. As we're going through things, obviously feel free to ask questions or clarification of things. But start off with just pointing out some key pieces of the course. Starting with, once we're in our U.S. history course, if we go into the modules page, that begins with the course materials section. It is there that you can find the syllabus. So if you ever need to kind of review class rules and policies, that's all contained in the syllabus. This is also where you can find the textbook online titled American Odyssey. So if you're going through a lesson and it says, okay, read these pages out of the textbook, drives me nuts that they don't just link to the textbook in the lesson, but here's where you can go to get into the textbook. Other things to note, obviously you'll need some sort of software for doing writing assignments. For most people, that's going to be Microsoft Word. But there are some that prefer or use Google Documents. That is fine. The one thing I just want to note there is if you're using Google Documents, do not submit the link to the Google document because I inevitably always have issues of like not having permission and can't get into the document. And if I can't get into it, I can't grade it. So if you are using Google Documents, what you should do is, once you're done, download that document as a PDF and then submit that PDF as your submission into the course. And if anyone needs help with how to do that, you can always email me, let me know. I'm happy to set up like an office hours time to walk you through that. But once you go into our textbook, it's going to look something like this. I want to point out just a couple of features here real fast. One, if you click the magnifying glass, that opens up text search. So if you're trying to find a specific piece of information, you can jump directly to where it's talked about in the textbook versus skimming through everything. So for example, if you were trying to answer a study guide question about the importance of Pearl Harbor to World War II, you could just type Pearl Harbor into the text search, and then it will show you the textbook pages that talk about Pearl Harbor. It's a good way to be more efficient with your time. The other thing I want to point out, if you're trying to get to a specific page number in the textbook, you want to go down here to thumbnail view, this button in the bottom left corner, and then there will be this text box where you can enter whatever page number you need to get to. So if you're trying to get to like page 300 versus scrolling or skimming through the entire textbook, you can just type 300 and get directly to the page number you need to get to. The big thing then to stress, figuring out what is it that is assigned for the week? What is it that you need to work on in the course for the week? That is always going to be spelled out in the announcements section. Because at the start of each week, I post a weekly agenda that will include any important information you need to be aware of. I usually try to include a link to the study guide for whatever unit we're on. So you have easy access to the study guides there. And then there will be the weekly agenda that will list out on a day-to-day basis what is assigned or what you need to work on. So for example, for today, a recommendation to review the syllabus, to review class policies. Tomorrow, we'll have a live class session. And then Friday, you have your first actual lesson assigned, 3.01. Now, you don't necessarily have to work on things on the days that they're listed, if you're someone who prefers to knock out like several items at once, that's totally fine. I just, break things down on a day-by-day basis to, for people who need that organization. But when a lesson is assigned, for example, 3.01, when you click on it, you're going to get a series of items. Each lesson is made up of several parts. You want to work through the full lesson. Now, most lessons will have a student guide. I do not require you to do the student guides. They are a resource there if you find them helpful or they help keep you organized. But you don't need to like turn them in, for example. But you want to make sure you work through the full lesson, including any checkpoint or quiz or assignment that's at the end of each lesson. And as some of you may recall from last semester, some of the checkpoints in U.S. history are going to ask you for a code word of some sort. And those checkpoints are basically just checking to see, did you actually work through the lesson and complete the lesson activities? Because it's the lesson activities where you get those code words. For example, once we get to lesson 3.09, it's going to ask you for a code word. Enter the word you received when you completed the access aggression activity. And then you may ask, like, well, where is the access aggression activity? These activities are always within the lesson themselves. So for the 3.09 checkpoint, it's in lesson 3.09. And you can see it linked right here within the lesson. So once you complete that lesson, it'll spit out the code word for you. When you get that code word, you really want to make sure you get the spelling right in order to get credit, because the course is not smart enough to identify, oh, you have the right word, you just misspelled it. So whether that's copying and pasting the code word or taking a screenshot of it, but make sure you get the spelling right so that it gives you the credit. And of course, if you end up having issues with something like that, you can email me and I can help out with that too. But it's obviously easier for everyone if you can just make sure you get the spelling correct. Every unit will have a study guide. It is my recommendation that you download that study guide and you fill it out as we work through each unit. You got to come to class anyway. You might as well kind of fill out the study guide as we go, especially because it is a school requirement to take and turn in notes for your classes. So at the end of each unit, there will be a 20-point assignment asking you to either turn in a completed study guide or your own notes. If you have your own system of note-taking that works for you, I don't want to mess that up or make you do additional work. You can turn in your own notes if you have your own system. Just make sure your notes kind of cover the full unit in order to get full credit, that they're covering the main topics of each unit. But ultimately, most people just turn in a completed study guide in order to complete this assignment. So for example, for our first unit, the first two questions of the study guide are basically questions asking about the causes of the Great Depression. That is what we will spend Monday's Class Connect talking about. So, as we're going through that lesson, I would kind of just recommend, filling in those study guide questions as we go during class. That way, by the end of the unit, you have a completed study guide or, a mostly completed study guide, and you don't have to spend a lot of, time and effort at the end of the unit, trying to fill out an entire study guide because you've done most of it just as we've gone through the unit. Regarding computer-graded assignments, checkpoints and quizzes by default will be set for multiple attempts, specifically 3. If you do poorly on a quiz, I would recommend, going back and retaking it. But you probably should review the material first. Spend some time thinking about, why did I miss these questions? What am I not understanding about this topic? Emailing me and asking, me for help if you need clarification on a particular topic, or another way of explaining things. When we get to the unit tests, by default, those are set for only one attempt. So you want to make sure you go into the unit test prepared. You don't just want to like wing it. But I also recognize sometimes people just have bad testing days. So you can earn a test retake. You just need to have a completed study guide, whether that's turned into the course or you can email it to me. And then you also then need to email me to let me know you want a test retake, because I have to manually set that up. But I require the completed study guide because I need something of yours I can look at to see like where we may be having misunderstandings before you retake that test and try to do better on it. We will also continue to have the weekly reflection assignments. Because we're an online school and I don't get to kind of check in with each of you face-to-face on a regular basis, I want something that allows me to kind of individually check in with each of you. And so that's the point of the weekly reflection assignments. But I also recognize you got busy lives, you have multiple classes you're trying to juggle, so I don't want to hog too much of your time. So the weekly reflections are not meant to be time-consuming assignments. I'm not asking for an essay. I'm not even asking for a paragraph, although you're welcome to write a paragraph if you want. Some people do. But really, I just need 2 sentences from you with the weekly reflections. The first is you identifying something you learned in U.S. history class from that week that stood out as being important and or interesting to you. Now, it's got to be something from that week. So you can't, for example, talk to me about something you learned over the Civil War. We talked about the Civil War last semester. It's got to be from that week in class. You also want to make sure you're not just naming a topic. Don't just say, I learned about the Great Depression or I learned about World War II. I want to see what you learned about that topic. Again, it doesn't need to be an essay. It can just be, explaining one thing you learned about that topic. The second sentence then is your reflective thoughts. Why is that concept that you learned important? How did it have an impact on the country, or how did it have an impact on people? Or making some sort of connection. What we learned in class that week. Can you connect it to other things or you're familiar about? Could be something you learned in another class. Maybe something we talked about in class reminded you of like a movie, a TV show, a book, a video game. Or, maybe it reminds you of things that are going on in the country today with current events. As long as you can explain the connection, I'm probably going to be good with it. But we will have our first weekly reflection at the end of next week. It's another reason why taking notes is helpful in class, because if you have notes, that gives you something you can refer back to for for something to write about for your weekly reflection. As some of you maybe found out last semester too, these are really assignments you don't want to procrastinate on and put off, because the longer you put off doing them, the harder it is to remember, like, well, what did we talk about, that specific week? At that point, you may need to go back and, review some recordings. I would recommend, getting them done just at the end of each week while things are still fresh in your mind. And you don't have to worry about remembering, what we talked about 3 or 4 weeks ago in U.S. history. I would also recommend checking your gradebook, really in all of your classes, at least once a week. So, once you're in our U.S. history course, clicking on grades will take you into your gradebook. That will give you the full detailed view of all the assignments we've had in the class so far and, what your grade is on them. This can help you identify any assignments you maybe missed and still need to get turned in. It can also help you identify assignments you may want to go back and redo. Maybe you go through a quiz and you're like, oh, I only got like a 5 out of 12 on this quiz. Let me review that material and try to get a better grade on that assignment. Because basically every assignment can be redone in this class. If you don't get full credit on a reflection, I will give you feedback letting you know what's missing or what still needs to be added to get full credit. You can then resubmit that. I do also want to spend some time here at the start of the semester talking a little bit about AI generated work. We'll spend more time tomorrow talking about this as well. But this has become a growing problem. Not just in my class, but like worldwide, really. But definitely, noticing students turning in more and more AI generated work year to year. So I want to be very upfront that turning AI generated work is a form of plagiarism. That is you turning in work that is not your own creation, but trying to claim it as your own. I can't give you credit for that. Any AI generated work will receive a 0, and that assignment will have to be redone. So really, you're just wasting time turning in AI generated work. You would have just been better off doing the assignment on your own the first time and saving both of us some time. Should also note that AI generators are not necessarily the most reliable thing, especially when it comes to doing history assignments. AI generators are not magic. They're not capable of doing critical thinking. They simply have gobbled up as much data as they can on the internet and regurgitate out what they can based on whatever prompt you give them. So for example, with AI generators, there's really no fact checking. If there, for example, is a piece of misinformation that is spread enough online, an AI generator will spit that out as well, thinking like, okay, well, that must be the case. That's what everyone's posting online. That's what we're going to spit out here. So again, any AI generated work will not receive credit. Now, I recognize this creates sometimes some messy situations where I'm reading something and I'm like, this seems suspicious. I'm going to mark it as a 0 as being AI generated. But maybe, a student where you turn something in that is your own creation and I mark it as a 0 saying, this does not seem like it's your own work. All you need to do is email me to let me know, like, hey, Mr. Nash, I think there might have been a mistake here. I did create this work. And then we'll just schedule a time for you to verbally walk me through your submission, which as long as, you actually wrote it, that should be very easy to do. And that way, then I can, kind of verify that, okay, yes, you are the creator of that work. I should also note here, let me go back real fast, that the writing assignments we have in this class are intentionally designed to not be a good fit for AI generation. For example, even just talking about the weekly reflections. Last semester, I got multiple people sending in submissions about World War II or the Civil Rights Movement. Things we never talked about last semester, because we're going to talk about them this semester. That's a pretty clear red flag that's an AI generated submission, because AI generators don't attend our U.S. history classes, so they don't actually know what did we talk about in class on a week-by-week basis. Or for example, later in the semester, we will do a family history project. An AI generator obviously does not know your individual family members, so it cannot create your family history project for you. So please do not make that mistake of turning in AI generated work. Next thing to emphasize, again, I want this to be a class where we have conversations about history. What do you think about this? Why did the country do that? How would you have responded if you were living during this time period? I do not want it to just be me talking to you, for 50 minutes straight. So to help further encourage that, I have made one change for this semester. Last semester, in order to obtain participation extra credit, you had to participate on the microphone. I've decided that I will change that to also include chat participation. So as we're going through, class discussion questions, if you contribute, of course on the mic still, but chat will also count. You will get an extra credit point for that unit. But it's got to be quality participation. If you just say like yes, no, or like I agree in the chat, like I'm not going to give you the point for that. But any sort of like real response to our discussion questions during class, that will earn you an extra credit point, which adds up over time. Right, exactly, Cyrus. If you are regularly participating in chat during our Class Connects, that's going to add up to a good chunk of extra credit. That could be the difference between getting a C+ versus a B-, for example. I of course expect everyone maintains a respectful and academic attitude in class. We're going to talk about things people might have strong opinions about one way or another. Politics, war, religion, social issues. And again, I want people to share their thoughts and perspectives. But of course, we also want to do that in a respectful way. We do not want to insult or attack other people in the process, which, never really ends up being a problem, but I always just like to emphasize that at the start of every semester. Finally, I do also ask that you don't post web links in the chat box, just because different households might have different rules regarding internet usage. I don't want to accidentally get anyone in trouble. If you have a link to something that you think would be cool to share with the class, email it to me first so I can look over it, just so we don't accidentally get anyone in trouble. And then finally, before I let you go today, I do just want to kind of make the sales pitch. High school, it's kind of your last opportunity to practice and build adult skills before you kind of have to adult full time. With us being an online school, that does in many ways, make it easier for students to hide behind their computer in one way or another. I understand that temptation, but I strongly encourage you to fight that temptation and to push yourself to participate in class as much as possible, to ask questions as much as possible, because the more you participate and communicate in class, you're really building those critical thinking skills that are going to be valuable to you as an adult, regardless of your career. I recognize the vast majority of you are not going to go into history-related fields as an adult, but you're probably going to have a job that requires critical thinking. And so the more that you participate in our history classes, the more you're practicing and building those critical thinking skills. So something to think about there. But that wraps up our class time for today. I will see you back here tomorrow where we'll spend some time talking about why even study history? What do we get out of it? But if you have any questions about the class, start of the semester, stick around, let me know. I'm happy to answer them as best I can. But otherwise, then you are good to go. Enjoy the rest of your day. I will see you back here tomorrow.